We're working through some sewing exercises, so you have seams with a professional finish that turn out like this and not this. The exercises we are working on today are sewing straight and curved lines, how to hold your fabric when sewing, what your fingers need to be doing, pinning, and where to focus your attention. The sewing samples we are going to make up are a straight and a curved seam at 1 centimetre and 0.5 centimetres. If you use the imperial system, you can use a 1/4 inch and 1/8 of an inch. We recommend using a medium weight fabric with a medium weave. We use calico or poplin as we find these are the best fabrics to learn to sew with. Now let's cut out the fabric for the samples. We are cutting the samples out of some poplin. We have folded the fabric up onto the selvage to cut the pieces for the straight seam exercise. The sizes you'll need are around 5 centimetres wide, which is about 2 inches, and about 40 centimetres long, which is about 15 inches. And you need to cut out a pair that are identical, which is why we are cutting them out on the fold. Once you've cut out at least 2 pairs, you will need to draw yourself the guidelines along one of the long edges. If you have a grading or a quilting ruler, you can use the 1 centimetre or 1/4 inch line as your guide. If you only have a normal ruler, that's okay. Just measure out the amount in a few different places along the edge and then use a ruler to fill in the gaps. You may notice that we don't draw solid lines, we dash out the lines. On the second pair, the guidelines you will need to draw are at 0.5 centimetres or 1/8 of an inch. The next exercise is a wow sample. This sample has a pile of techniques rolled into the one, which includes a 90-degree corner, a pointed corner, an outer curve going into an inner curve, and stitching into the seam to finish rather than a back stitch. We have attached a PDF for you to print, or you can draw out your own. When cutting out the wow sample, you will need to find the grain in the fabric and cut out 3 pairs. After cutting out the wow samples, the guidelines will need to be drawn onto them. The first sample, you'll draw out 1 centimetre or 1/4 inch from the edge all the way around, and then draw another 1 centimetre or 1/4 inch on the inside of that. For the second one, your guidelines will be at 0.5 centimetres or 1/8 of an inch, and the last one will be sewn without any guidelines. Now we have come to pinning. As the samples we are using are small, we are only pinning them in the centre to keep them lined up. There are many ways to pin pattern pieces for different reasons, but the main way of pinning is perpendicular to the seam, crossing the seam line or sew line. The reason for this is it minimises how much the fabric can move on that sew line. The 2 biggest mistakes people make when pinning is not lining up the pattern pieces and the notches correctly, and then there is overpinning. If you use too many pins, you don't have the flexibility to correct fabric placement while you are sewing. The samples that we start with today have marked out sew lines, but after practicing sewing straight a little bit, you won't draw in your guidelines anymore. And this is how to set up some guidelines on your machine. Your sewing machine has seam allowance guidelines engraved into the plate, but you can use other guides to make it easier. Measuring out from the needle, you can place a line of tape at your seam allowance distance. You can also use a magnet with a straight side, or there is a range of different seam magnets that you can buy. I like this one as it has a magnet on the top to hold pins. Now we're up to the sewing part. The seam allowance side of the sample goes under the machine. If you are left-handed, this may feel awkward, but with practice you'll get used to it. When you place the fabric under the sewing foot, make sure that the short ends line up equally and the long edges are placed directly on top of each other. Also, it is best to start sewing your seams about 1 centimetre down from the end. Sew a stitch or 2, then back stitch and stop just before the end, then start sewing your seam. This helps to keep the ends neat and not pulled. When sewing, your focus needs to be around the seam allowance line at the needle and the area just before where the fabric goes under the foot. You are mainly monitoring that everything is lined up with each other and the correct amount of seam allowance that has been allocated is being followed. In the industry, we use our fingers and hands like tools, so depending on what you are sewing, you will need to use different techniques with your hands and fingers for different seams and hems on different fabrics. Your hands should rarely be flat, and this is for a couple of different reasons. Your left hand, fingers and nails are used to control and move the fabric layers to ensure that the edges are sitting directly on top of each other as they are being fed under the foot and are being sewn. If you are sewing delicate fabric, you may need to use your left hand to hold the threads behind the needle on the seam you have just sewn. This is to control the tension of the seam, but don't pull the fabric, just hold the tension of the thread. Your right hand is mainly used to hold the fabric pieces together using a little tension to control the fabric being fed under the foot. This is an important part of the process as the feed dogs, which are the metal teeth under the presser foot, are there to push the fabric through while you are sewing. But at the same time, there is friction caused from the presser foot pushing down on the fabric. By holding your fabric while you are sewing, you can control how the fabric is being fed into the seam. This means that you should not let the fabric slide between your fingers as you are sewing. As you can see, I'm holding the fabric pieces together in my right hand and controlling it being fed under the foot at the same rate. We've been talking about sewing techniques as the demo has been playing. Now it's time to talk about the sample sewing exercises. The first sample to start with is the straight 1 cm or 1/4 inch seams. As mentioned earlier, start a little down from the end, sew 2 or so stitches, then back stitch until just before the end, then start sewing the seam. Go slow using your hands as explained earlier, following your guidelines you have drawn. If you start sewing off the line, stop, pick up the foot and the needle, move the fabric so that the line sits under the needle and keep sewing. Sew as many of the samples of the 1 cm or the 1/4 inch straight lines with the guides until you've mastered them. You may need to do more than one sample for this. Once you have sewn the straight 1 cm 1/4 inch sample lines using the guidelines and then sewn some 1 cm lines without any guidelines, continue on with sewing your samples of 0.5 cm or 1/8 of an inch straight samples. I have sewn one side of the sample with guidelines and the other side without guidelines, but you can make up separate samples if you like. Now we move on to the wow sample. It seems like an easy enough thing to sew, but looks can be deceiving. Now you are going to start the seam at the center of the long straight edge with the sample sewing towards the 90-degree corner with the outer curve. Don't backstitch, sew until you reach the corner. Stop with the needle in the corner, lift the presser foot and turn the fabric so that you are now heading down the side. When you reach the start of the curve, go slow and feed the fabric in, making sure that both layers of the fabric are directly on top of each other. Follow the outer curve, then slowly follow the change of direction of the inner curve. Once you've reached the pointed corner with the needle in the corner, pick up your presser foot and turn the fabric so that you can sew down the straight seam with a crisp point corner. When you reach the next 90-degree corner, stop at the corner with the needle in the corner, pick up the presser foot and turn the fabric so that you can sew down the long straight side. Once you are getting close to the seam where you started, focus on the first few stitches as you are aiming to stitch into those stitches. Make sure that you stitch between 4 and 8 stitches into them. A few things to consider when making samples is to use contrasted coloured thread. This helps you see any imperfections in the sewing so you know what you need to work on. If you get contrasting threads in a seam to look good, your seams with matching or complementary threads will look amazing. It is also a good idea to use a different coloured thread on the top and in the bobbin. Once you have finished your 1 cm or 1/4 inch wow sample, next work on your 0.5 cm or 1/8 of an inch sample, and then the wow sample with no guidelines. You may want to do a few of the 1 cm or 1/4 inch wow samples first, just to train your eye. For the sample that I used in the tute, I have done one seam using a guideline of 1 cm and the next seam without any guidelines. Feel free to mix it up and make your samples however you like. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the tute. If you haven't yet, click like, share and subscribe. This will help other sewers in our sewing community find the video.